China is one of the most powerful and authoritarian nations on Earth, with the ambition to overtake the United States and become the global superpower in the coming decades. And with coronavirus heating up the Cold War between East and West, China wants to use the global pandemic to accelerate their rise to the top. But it wasn't always like this. Just 30 years ago, the country was still recovering from one of the worst famines experienced in human history. The economy was smaller than that of Great Britain's, and over 750 million people were living below the poverty line. So how did Communist China become the second most influential country on Earth? And how and why did the West allow for its rise? China's complicated history and its meteoric rise can be attempted to be understood through the prism of one man, someone you've likely never heard of. His name is Chang Ying-yong. In 1954, Chang decided to join the People's Liberation Army, the military wing of the People's Republic of China. He quickly rose through the ranks as a military doctor, eventually becoming a major general and the chief surgeon of the 301 hospital in Beijing. Once a rising star in the Communist Party, he would go on to become one of their most powerful adversaries. Today, he is under house arrest. His extraordinary journey shadows Communist China's rise. We'll come back to Chang later. To understand China's unprecedented rise, you have to look at the Chinese Communist Party's coveted history. You have to look at the story they would rather you not know. China is a one-party authoritarian state. That means no democratic elections, and the whole country is essentially run by the ruling party, which is headed by a man called Xi Jinping. China's modern-day history arguably starts in 1946.
From Suzhou come the last pictures taken before the capture of the city by communist forces, continuing their drive towards Nanking.
World War II has just finished, and the world is in flux. A civil war breaks out between Chinese nationalists, who are largely supported by the West, and communists. After years of bitter fighting, the communists win, and the nationalists are exiled to Taiwan. The following decades represent the repression of hundreds of millions of people by China's leader, Mao ZEDONG. Mao's attempts to reform and industrialise the largely agricultural economy leads to the deaths of between 10 and 40 million people. It may be difficult for people to understand just how many people that is who died, but think of it like this: that's the equivalent of up to half of the entire UK population being wiped out in one generation. Mao's communist reforms begin to wreak havoc on the economy. In 1958, the Great Leap Forward attempts to boost China's industrial capacity through unrealistic targets, the collectivization of agriculture, and abolishing all private ownership of land. The result is one of the worst famines known to man. In 1966, Mao introduces the Cultural Revolution, aimed at destroying all symbols of Western culture or capitalism in China. Most of the country's cultural heritage is destroyed. Bands of Red Guards terrorise intellectuals or anyone seen to be a threat to Mao's leadership, and thousands of innocent people are sent to brutal labour camps. During this period of terror, the West views China's communist regime as illegitimate and fights them through proxy wars, first in Korea and later in Vietnam. The US blocks the People's Republic of China from taking a seat at the United Nations and places an embargo on the communist country. However, in 1971, an unexpected relationship between American and Chinese ping-pong athletes paves the way for a visit to China from President Nixon the following year, in what became known as ping-pong diplomacy. Slowly, relations improved, And after Mao's death in 1976, America establishes formal diplomatic ties in 1979 for the first time with Communist China. Meanwhile, a new chairman of the Communist Party takes power in 1978, Deng Xiaoping. Xiaoping blames Mao for the horrors the Chinese people have suffered and begins to reform the country. New economic reforms mean the government exerts less control over businesses and land ownership. China begins to privatize industries and opens up to foreign investment. Western money pours in, keen to take advantage of cheap labour, low rental costs, and near lack of regulations. Throughout the 1980s, the economy begins to grow. The first KFC opens in China in 1987, with McDonald's following in 1991. But don't be fooled by the economic and political reforms of Deng Xiaoping. The brutal Communist Party still held power. In 1989, while the Soviet Union is crumbling, students in Tiananmen Square demand democracy and freedom. A brave unknown person, now dubbed Tank Man, stands in front of the military in defiance of the regime. The protesters are crushed, and at least 10,000 people are murdered by the state. Meanwhile, Chang Ying-yong, our senior military surgeon, watches the events unfold in horror, but decides not to say anything. The Chinese people and the world are reminded of the communists' brutality. This may have been a warning sign for the West that the country's dictatorship hadn't truly changed, but if it was ignored. The US and other Western countries believe that by allowing China into world markets, democracy will begin to flourish. They also believe that Western companies will be able to make billions of pounds from trade with China.
The West certainly contributed to the rise of China, provided the infrastructure, provided in many cases the finance, but we have to realize that the impulse was coming from within China. This is an old commercial trade civilization that, particularly 30 years ago, had a lot of drive, ambition for the future. It was a young society, and the West was there, provided openness to world markets and the infrastructure that China needed at the time. I think it's typical of a society at the height of its powers like the West, particularly after the end of the Cold War, to think that the whole world is going to be assimilated to the same model, that the whole world is going to become like us. That was in many respects a tragic mistake.
Bill Clinton spoke in 2000 arguing why China should join the World Trade Organization.
This agreement exchanges membership rights for China in the WTO for economic opportunities for America in China. Getting into a rules-based system and promoting economic competition will both enhance the march of liberty and law and human rights.
In the same year, the Chinese government consolidates internet regulations, paving the path for future mass censorship and control. The next year, the communist power joins the World Trade Organization and wins the bid for the 2008 Olympics. Crucially, in 2002, a coronavirus named SARS emerges from a Chinese animal market. Chang Ying-yong sees the pandemic spread quickly, but he notices that the number of cases being reported by his government to the world and the actual number of people he is treating for SARS is hugely different. With outrage, Chang writes an 800-word letter to Chinese media outlets explaining how the Communist Party was drastically underreporting the number of SARS cases. Unsurprisingly, no media outlet publishes his letter. He doesn't even receive a reply. However, several Western newspapers obtain the information and publish his letter. For the first time, the world is alerted to the actual situation in China. The publication of Chang's letter is so serious, the Minister for Public Health and the Mayor of Beijing resign, and the government starts to take swift action to tackle the pandemic. Public health experts at the time believe as a direct result of Chang Ying-yong's letter, the state took the pandemic seriously.
Without Dr. Jiang Yangyong's letter, the world would have still been left in the dark, and we don't know how many more people would have died. If the CCP was able to continue to cover up the SARS, it would have also suffered much greater losses. So I think the CCP should be very grateful to Dr. Jiang Yangyong.
The following decade represents what economists describe as an economic miracle. Hundreds of millions of people are lifted out of poverty. China becomes the world's largest exporter and second largest economy. Yet the repression, censorship, and authoritarianism of the Chinese Communist Party continues. The economy is set up with a balance between state ownership and control of companies and a free market system. In 2013, Xi Jinping becomes the country's leader, and he has a new vision for a global China, one which doesn't play by the international rules. One expert told The Sun Online, Xi views other countries as either rivals or clients. Instead of working through the WTO, Xi sets up the Belt and Road Initiative, investing billions of dollars into infrastructure projects in poor, developing countries to boost China's trade. While the West fails to invest in Africa and developing nations, China builds roads, ports and dams, and in return owns vast swathes of natural resources in those countries. The world assumed it would integrate China. Instead, China is integrating the world. Xi also cracks down on internal rivals and centralises his power even further. The Chinese military is given hundreds of billions of dollars to expand and takes aggressive action in the South China Sea to bolster the Communist Party's power in the region. In 2018, Xi Jinping removes term limits on presidents, meaning he can extend his period in power indefinitely. 1 year later, a new coronavirus hits the world. Again, the government attempts to cover up the seriousness of the pandemic with dire consequences. Li Wenliang, a doctor in Wuhan, warns his colleagues in late December of a new deadly coronavirus, COVID-19. He is arrested and forced to sign a document reprimanding him for spreading dangerous and false rumours. Soon after, Dr. Li dies of coronavirus. In February of 2020, it was reported Chang Ying-yong is under house arrest after writing to Xi Jinping that the events in Tiananmen Square were a crime. China's extraordinary rise has not only seen the native population moved out of mass poverty, but has also aided nations all around the world with increased trade and demand in their economies. However, it is a fact that an authoritarian regime in Beijing remains strong, and far from introducing democratic reforms since its acceptance into the world's marketplace, the reverse has taken place. And as the SARS and the current COVID-19 outbreaks show, the regime's actions can have deadly consequences for the entire world.